So welcome, everyone. I'm Marie Asher. I'm the director of the library at New York Medical College, and I thank you all for coming today, and I extend a greeting to all online attendees as well. Today, we have a special program in commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, as well as the coming of Black History Month. International Holocaust Remembrance Day is held annually on January 27th to commemorate the anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp in 1945. That happened 80 years ago yesterday. So now we light the candle for Yom HaShoah in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. We will never forget, and we light this candle to honor those who perished. We honor the dead by remembering and making sure no one ever forgets by telling the very real stories of the Holocaust. This year, it is entirely appropriate that we celebrate in conjunction with Black History Month, not only because of the many parallels between Nazism and white supremacism in our own country, but because of the particular stories you will hear today. Before we get underway, I'd like to acknowledge Ambassador Withers and members of his family, to welcome family members of Pee Wee and Solomon, the two young men whose stories the ambassador will describe, to acknowledge the support of the Miriam Popak Chair in Biomedical Ethics after the Holocaust and the Hearth and Samowitz Center for Medical Humanities and Holocaust Studies. And we thank the co-sponsors of this afternoon's program, the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center of White Plains, New York, and the Center for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Education of North Carolina, and Holocaust Speakers Bureau. For those of you who are seeking CME credits today, here are the instructions. You have approximately 72 hours to claim your credits. I'll leave this slide up just a minute while I handle two other housekeeping tidbits. There will be a Q&A segment immediately following the presentation of Ambassador Withers' pre-recorded talk and some remarks by Dr. Mil Etienne. Ambassador Withers will be present to answer any questions. So for those of you who are attending virtually, please use the Zoom Q&A function to submit your questions. Also, after reviewing the content of today's program, we concluded that we are very likely to run over time. So please be aware of that. We apologize in advance, but we also think this is important content and we do not want to rush. So to lead us off today, we will have some context setting by Dr. Edward Halpern, who is the Chancellor and Chief Executive Officer of New York Medical College, a professor of radiation oncology, pediatrics, and medical history. He's the Miriam Popak Chair in Biomedical Ethics after the Holocaust and the director of the Hearth and Samowitz Center for Medical Humanities and Holocaust Studies at New York Medical College, as well as being the provost for biomedical affairs of Touro University. Dr. Halpern.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My topic for today is to put today's stories in historical context by giving you a very brief history of racial segregation and desegregation in the United States military. I have no conflicts of interest to declare in reference to today's remarks. There are four goals for my remarks this afternoon: to explain to you under what legal authority the United States has a military, to review the notable events in the history of racial segregation and desegregation in the military, including those related to New York Medical College, to make it clear that racial segregation in the United States military is not solely a story of Black soldiers and sailors, nor is racial segregation in the military a uniquely American story, and to lay the groundwork for the speakers who will follow me this afternoon. Who has the authority in the United States to establish and command a military? Article 1 of the United States Constitution vests the power in Congress to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be longer than 2 years. It is the power of Congress to provide and maintain a navy, and it is third, the power of Congress to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, to suppress insurrections, and to repel invasions. That is why the United States has, in some sense, 3 militaries: a federal military under direct federal control, a federal military reserve under direct federal control, and what was called in the 18th century the militia, which we now call the National Guard, under the control of the states and the federal government. Article 2 of the United States Constitution states that the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia when the militia is called into service of the United States. It is, from high school civics, a classic separation of powers story for the military, with some powers vested in the legislative branch and some in the executive. George Washington was opposed to the desegregation of the Revolutionary Army, but George Washington was in no position to argue the point. He was so outgunned and undermanned by the British that his objection to blacks in the Revolutionary Army was not observed. This 1840s era painting of the Battle of Bunker Hill shows a single colonial soldier with a sword drawn facing down an enormous number of British troops and loyalists, including the death of Major Pitcairn dying in the arms of his son on the British side. But look in the corner of the picture. Who's over the shoulder of that single revolutionary soldier in the blue uniform? There's a black man in the painting. His name was Peter Salem of the Rhode Island troops, and he was the one who fired the shot that killed Major Pitcairn at Bunker Hill. In Savannah, Georgia, there is a monument to 500 black troops of the Haitian military under the command of French officers who fought valiantly on the American side in the siege of Savannah. From the end of the Revolutionary War until the Civil War, Congress had passed laws forbidding the recruitment of black troops in the military. But when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, he opened the door to black recruitment for the Union Army, and black men served in the Union Army and Navy. They were in segregated units with white officers. In response to protests, the Union Army commissioned just over 100 black officers for the 166 black regiments, none commissioned above captain. Black troops were paid less than white troops in the Civil War. That was corrected in 1864 when pay was equalized. The Confederacy threatened to execute or enslave any black prisoner of war. Indeed, they massacred some of them. Abraham Lincoln responded by promising he would shoot one Confederate prisoner for every black soldier executed by the Confederacy, and he would put one Confederate POW to hard labor for every black soldier enslaved by Confederate forces. Eventually, 179,000 black troops served in the Union Army and Navy. In the Civil War, 169,000 in the Army, 10,000 in the Navy. They represented 10% of all federal troops. Recruitment rates were extraordinarily high. 4/5 of black Northern Americans served in the Union Army, over half of those in the border states, and 1/5 of those who had recently been enslaved. Combat mortality among black troops in the Civil War was lower because they were rarely used in combat, but their overall mortality was much higher. They were billeted in areas with the worst water supply, the worst sanitation areas, and their death from infectious disease was very high. After the end of the Civil War, we maintained Black troops in the wars fighting indigenous Americans in the American West. And thus we have our first connection with New York Medical College. The valedictorian of the New York Medical College class of 1870, Susan Smith. On the far side of the slide is her at her time as New York Medical College, holding her head on her hand. As an older physician, still with her head on her hand, that must have been her habit. The map is of Susan Smith McKinney Stewart Park in Brooklyn. There's also a public school named after her. She grew up in a farm in a rural area called Brooklyn. Her first husband, McKinney, dies relatively young. She is noted at the Museum of the New York Historical Society with this bit of textile art where her last name is hyphenated with her second husband. Her second husband was this man, Colonel Stewart of the United States Army, a chaplain, Theophilus Gould Stewart, a chaplain to the United States All-Black Cavalry. Historical wits will say that when you watch those television westerns and you hear the bugle call, da 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 da, here comes the cavalry to the rescue of the wagon train, and they zoom in. It's not John Wayne and all white troops who are responding. Those were Black troops that were responding to save the wagon train. Called by some people the Buffalo Soldiers. Here you see them lined up in the latter part of the 19th century. The consummate publicity hound of the Spanish-American War was a New York City politician named Theodore Roosevelt, who had the American people convinced that he was the commander of the Rough Riders. He was not. The commander was a doctor, Leonard Wood, seated here in the middle. His subordinate was Colonel Roosevelt, who ordered his uniform from Brooks Brothers. When San Juan Hill was captured, Roosevelt is pictured with the all-white Rough Riders, but that's not the historical truth. The Rough Riders were pinned down by Spanish gunfire, and the 8th and 9th Cavalry was there, all Black units of the United States Cavalry, not mounted. They were the ones who charged San Juan Hill and overran the Spanish positions. Their mortality rate was about 30 to 40%. Roosevelt spends a while discussing this in his 1899 book, The Rough Riders. Gives great credit to the Black troops. They were commanded by white officers, including General John Pershing, who was called in the polite press Blackjack Pershing for his command of Black troops. He had a different name in the less than polite conversations about him. He held his Black troops in great esteem. He went on to command all United States troops in World War I. There are differing views of what Roosevelt had to say about Black troops. I think for today's purposes, it's simply, I will say that they were mixed in his comments as he was promoting his own value in the Spanish-American War, which elevates him to governor of New York, then vice president, and then president. The United States deployed Black troops in World War I. They included an alumnus of New York Medical College, Clarence Sumner Janifer, a graduate of New York Medical College, but the United States Army would not have Black doctors take care of white troops. He was seconded to the French Army. Dr. Janifer, for performing surgery under German attack, received the Croix de Guerre for heroism from the French Army. He returned to the United States, went into practice in Newark, New Jersey, and was the first Black member of the New Jersey Medical Society. In World War II, there are multiple named Black units: the Red Ball Express, the Transport Unit, the Tuskegee Airmen, and all Black Women's Army Corps units. 1 million Black citizens served in the Army and Navy in World War II. 2 weeks ago, Mrs. Halpern and I went to the Yale Historical Collection, the Beinecke Library, where you can see the light streaming in through cut marble to protect the books that are encased in the glass cases, to view the video archives of Yale on the Holocaust and on liberators. There is the Gutenberg Bible. and I turned the corner to watch this video of Mr. Leon Bass of Philadelphia explaining how all Black reconnaissance and intelligence units were sent for the liberation and investigation of Buchenwald. The next two pictures are photographs of Black troops at the liberation of Buchenwald. For those of you who are sensitive to such images, you may want to look away. I will tell you when I am done showing them. You see the members of the United States Army seeing bodies stacked in Buchenwald, and a United States Army soldier encountering a railroad car with stacked bodies. For those who didn't want to look at the pictures, they're off the screen. We have testimony from some survivors, such as this. I lost consciousness at the time of the liberation of my camp. When I awoke, I was surrounded by Black men. I had never seen a Black person in Poland. My initial thought was I had died. This was heaven, and God and everyone else was Black. Black units were not the only segregated units of the United States Armed Forces. Native American units, particularly of the Oklahoma National Guard when they were federalized. All Japanese American units fighting in Europe, recently commemorated on a United States postage stamp. When President Harry Truman in 1948 issued a presidential command to desegregate the military, it was largely ignored. It took the military 15 years to respond to Truman's directive. The most recalcitrant were the Marines and the Navy. But you remember when I began, I told you that we had three military, the military reserve, and the National Guard. This is the Republican governor of New Jersey in 1947, Alfred P. Driscoll. Governor Driscoll had shepherded through a vote in New Jersey for a new New Jersey state constitution, authored in part by my uncle, Justice Nathan Jacobs. The New Jersey Constitution says explicitly that no qualified person shall be denied any civil or military right, nor be discriminated against in the exercise of any civil or military right, nor be segregated in the militia or in the public schools because of religious principles, race, color, ancestry, or national origin. The first unit of the United States military to be desegregated in United States history was the New Jersey Air National Guard under the orders of Governor Driscoll because of the New Jersey Constitution. Racially segregated military units were certainly not unique to the United States. And to repel the dastardly invasion by the Americans into Canada, all Black military units responded to fight off the barbaric Americans. This is a Canadian veteran showing his medals from fighting off the Americans in the War of 1812. The Canadian Army had all Black units in World War I and World War II. At the end of Casablanca, Louis says to Rick, you know, with the money you got from selling Rick's Cafe, that'll just about pay our passageway. We're going to go to Brazzaville. There's a free French garrison in Brazzaville. Louis, this could be the start of a wonderful friendship. And they walk off into the dust. But that free French unit in Brazzaville, those were Black French troops in Brazzaville. 60% of the Free French Army in World War II were Black. Here they are in a German prisoner of war camp. Here they are on review in Paris. When it was decided that the Free French would be the ones to liberate Paris, not the British or American armies, we have letters from the British and the French to Charles de Gaulle saying, we will not have the newsreel show Black troops liberating Paris. You are to scrounge together enough white troops to show them on the newsreels liberating Paris. And de Gaulle did. Here is de Gaulle in his famous walk through Paris on the liberation of Paris. But there is a commander of the resistance in the picture with his arm in a sling from being wounded in the attack on the Germans. When the public relations people realized that this Black resistance commander was in the frame of the picture, he was escorted out of the image at gunpoint. to make sure that only whites appeared in the picture. The South African Army fought in World War I and World War II and had units of the Native Guard used as ambulance drivers and stretcher bearers in the South African Army. At the end of World War II, white South African veterans were given a new house from a grateful nation. Black veterans were given either a bicycle or a pair of boots. The British Army had His Majesty's Jewish Brigade, an all-Jewish unit of combatants from British occupied Palestine. They itched to get into the fight, were finally put into combat in Italy in 1944 and 45. To the astonishment of regular British troops, His Majesty's Jewish Brigade ran ahead of the tanks instead of behind them to attack German pillboxes. There were 100 casualties of this very small unit. My goals for my brief remarks this afternoon were to tell you what the legal authority was for the United States to have a military to review notable events in history of racial segregation and desegregation in the military, to tell you a few stories about New York Medical College, to make it clear that racial segregation is not solely a story of Black soldiers and sailors, nor was racial segregation unique to the American military, and to lay the groundwork for the other speakers this afternoon. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Halperin. Next, we will hear from John Withers II, who served as ambassador to Albania under both George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Ambassador Withers graduated from Harvard University and McGill before receiving his PhD from Yale University. We are happy to have you here, Ambassador Withers, and look forward to hearing the story you tell us. Dr. Withers has pre-recorded his talk and will be available for Q&A after the talk. So again, feel free to think of questions or enter questions in the Q&A. And for those of you in the room, if you'd wish, during the break between, to step up and light a candle in commemoration. Thank you.
My name is John L. Withers II. Let me begin by offering my profound thanks to the Center on Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Education in North Carolina. And I would like particularly to express my gratitude to Sharon and Edward Halperin, and to Ashley McCarrick for all of their support and assistance in allowing me to say a few words for this really important event commemorating Holocaust Remembrance and Black History Month. I want to tell you a story, a simple story. It's a story that takes place against the backdrop of huge historical events: World War II, the Holocaust, the Jim Crow era in the United States. But it's primarily about the story of three young men brought together in the most unusual and unlikely circumstances that formed a friendship that affected them all of their lives and assisted them as they faced recurring obstacles that they encountered throughout their lives. So please come back with me to the spring of 1945. The war in Europe had just ended with Germany's surrender. And at that particular time, an all African-American truck company, remember that the US Army was racially segregated at that time, but this truck company received an emergency order, an urgent order to take supplies from the depot to an unknown German village with an unpronounceable name. Now, the men in this company, again, they were all African American. One of their officers was my father, John L. Withers of Greensboro, North Carolina. And they were not thinking about yet another emergency order, yet another German village. They were thinking about going home. The war was over, and they looked forward to returning back to their families, to their friends, to get their mothers home cooking, to see their old girlfriend again, to hang out with the guys. And so when they reached this German village, they were shocked because it happened to be the Dachau concentration camp shortly after the camp was liberated. Now, these were men who had endured a lot of hard times in their lives. Many of them were from the Deep South, where segregation prevailed and white supremacy was the law of the land. And they had fashioned their lives in very difficult circumstances, sharecropping and dirt farmers and the most menial of manual labor. In the war, they had seen the destruction. They had seen prisoners of war camps, horrors that they hadn't imagined previously. And yet, nothing reached the degree of horror as what they saw in Dachau, even as the international communities and humanitarian organizations were striving to bring order to the situation and to bring some relief to the many, many, many inmates who were still there. They delivered their supplies. They went to their assigned barracks in Munich. But a day or two later, they were further shocked when, over that next couple of days, 2 young Holocaust survivors, still in their striped concentration camp outfits, emaciated, thin, covered with sores, arrived at the gate of their camp, and in sign language and in bits of broken English and German, pleaded with the troops for help. They were willing to do anything. They were willing to wash dishes. They were willing to clean the trucks or whatever the soldiers might need, just anything to assist them to get by in these terrible conditions of post-war Germany. And this, of course, presented this truck company, the men in this truck company, with a real dilemma. It was very much against military regulations to have contact with these displaced persons, as they were called at that time. The army was fearful that such people, so exposed to contagious diseases as they had been, could get infected, and a truck company moving all around Europe as it had to do might infect a good portion of the army. Moreover, what would be the effects of seeing the horrors that these men had seen? And this was a rigid, highly disciplined wartime army. So punishments were severe and immediate. And the men were fully cognizant of the fact that if you got a stain on your record, if you, heaven forbid, were dishonorably discharged, it would really affect the possibilities before you when you went home. Right? Who's going to hire someone with that kind of stain on their record? And what would people think of a man who went off to war and got in trouble with the army? My dad's case, for example, my father at that time was a bit older and quite a bit more educated than most of the men in his company. He had managed to get a master's degree from the University of Wisconsin and had hoped that he could build upon that for further education, maybe a PhD or something like that, that would allow him greater opportunities to seek employment, a better way of life, maybe in a northern state away from the Jim Crow South. And so there was a considerable risk involved. Now the troops could have done any number of things in response to these kids. They simply could have told them, scram. You know, you're not allowed here. Go. Or they could have given them a box of rations, headed them to the nearest Red Cross station, and considered themselves as having done a good deed. Instead, they chose a third option. They smuggled the kids into the camp. And over the next year, they kept them hidden from any type of military authority, any inspectors that might come by, the military police who might be nosing around, anyone, from realizing that these two young white kids were in the midst of an all-black company of 150 men. And over the course of that time, they fed them, clothed them, nursed them back to health. Over time, they began to incorporate them into the unit. They worked in the kitchen, but later on, the men trained them into the maintenance of the different vehicles. They taught them how to drive a Jeep or a truck. They taught them how to maintain it. And over the course of that year, developed a bond with these young men that made them pretty close to the younger brothers of the troop. There were, of course, adjustments that had to be made. It turned out that these two young men were from Poland. They didn't like to talk about their backgrounds. They refused absolutely to talk about what had happened to them, their families, their towns during the war. But they were Polish, and the men had extreme difficulty in simply pronouncing their names. Right, the older boy, who was about 19, and the younger, who was about 16, looked much younger than than they actually were, no doubt because of the state of malnutrition that they had suffered over these last years. The older boy's name was Shlomo Yaskowitz. And the men figured out that Shlomo is the equivalent of the German Solomon or the English Solomon, so they just called him Solomon. The younger was named Mieczysław Weichensperr. And the men just despaired. There was no way guys with their soft Southern drawls and their slow Georgia or Alabama tongues could get around a name that complicated. And so they just gave him that fond old Southern nickname, Pee Wee. So Pee Wee and Solomon, the latest recruits in the truck company. The kids themselves had never encountered Black people before, and they found a number of the soldiers' ways odd, not in the least threatening. The soldiers were as friendly and as welcoming as they could be, but odd. And so, for example, baseball. The kids had no understanding of baseball. In fact, they found it was really sort of a crazy sport. You take a round ball and you try to swing at it with a cylinder, and then you whirl around in circles a lot. But other things, many of the men would pomade their hair at night, and then they would take a woman's stocking, cut it, tie a knot in the top, and pull it down over their heads to keep the hair in style. And the kids didn't understand that. And so they tried to solve their curiosity over time by gravitating toward my father. My father was a lieutenant. He was an officer. He was older than the men. And as I say, he had quite a bit more educated. And so at the end of the day, when work was done, they would go to his quarters and they would spend part of the evening talking to my dad, who they found a little more mature and articulate, and able to try to put the different customs into place. They would tell little stories, jokes, sing songs, and this became kind of a routine for them. And my dad welcomed them. He recognized what they had gone through, even if they wouldn't talk about it, and was, eager to make them feel welcome. But he noticed over time, as this proceeded, that there was more to it than simply trading little anecdotes on an evening. They began always, somewhere in the midst of their conversations, they always began to raise questions about America. What was America like? Was America all that they said? Did it have the skyscrapers? Did it have opportunities for work? If they somehow got to America, could they make a good livelihood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, just constantly on America. And he began to realize that America had symbolic meaning to them, deep symbolic meaning to them. It was not just a place, it was an ideal. And they were looking toward this idealized America for hope. They were looking for reasons to believe, again, in this terrible thing call life that had so mistreated them for so many years? Was there some purpose in striving to go on? And it fell to my dad, who was no psychologist, just another guy, to try to persuade them that although their life up to then had been terrible, they should still retain hope. There was still a future out there for them to seek and to strive for. After about a year, and again, over the course of that year, these young men traveled when the convoys, the truck convoys would move out. They would travel with the men. They had to hide from the MPs along the road who were checking certificates and that kind of thing. They had to adapt to every situation, every station that where the men were assigned. And eventually, they came to rest in a beautiful little village called Staffelstein, not far from the great city of Bamberg. And it was at that time that the signals started to come that the company was on the verge of demobilizing. There came a day when my father received his orders, and he was, going to be sent back to the United States. He would depart the military and he would go home. When that day came, they exchanged gifts. They felt confident enough at that time to, in the army uniforms that the soldiers had provided, to click their heels and to give him a salute. And they all resolved one day that they were going to get together again in America. My father departed, never really knowing if he would see them again. He returned to the United States. His hopes for getting assistance from the GI Bill came true. He got his PhD from the University of Chicago. He met a lovely lady, married her. She was my mom. Later on, my brother came along. And eventually he moved into a US government job, the US service, the economic assistance programs, in which the United States assists developing countries throughout the world. And we were assigned to different places throughout Asia, Africa, and so on as we grew up. He remained a tremendous storyteller. And all through those years, he just would tell us stories. When we were little kids and so on, we loved his war stories. Particularly, we believed that our dad was a hero like John Wayne or Audie Murphy that had single-handedly won the war. But he would tell us the time the convoy was strafed by the German Luftwaffe and different other stories like that we found very exciting. But he almost always ended those stories by telling this one story which we didn't quite understand. About two kids that had somehow come and had somehow gotten, we didn't understand it, but he told that story again and again as we grew and as we grew. And we began to discover its real meaning for him. How that act of kindness, himself and his men, meant so much to him. Time passed. He had a very successful government career. eventually retired. But then in his 80s, he was struck by cancer. And it changed him. This gregarious, outgoing, humorous, inclusive human being turned inward, became introspective. And it worried me. And I asked my mother at the time, what was going on? He said, well, he's elderly now. He's vulnerable. He has this terrible disease. And like people, men of his age, he's surveying his life. Now that he feels he can't alter it very much, he's surveying his life and he's trying to come up with a summation as to what his life might have been. And I said to her, well, that doesn't make any sense. He's led a wonderful life. People love him. He's done well. He's raised a family. And she said, well, you can't tell him that. You'll have to show him. And somehow out of that conversation, it finally occurred to me that one way to show him was to see if I could search for men that might have been in his unit during the war. And hope of hopes, somewhere down the line, search for these two young men that he still felt so close to. And so I began a search, not knowing what it would involve. And what it mainly involved was years. The internet was not at all what it is today. And many of the records were still being organized, and many of them had not yet been made public. And there were rules. The Veterans Administration could not simply put you in contact with the men. There were privacy regulations and so forth and so on. And I only had Mieczysław Weichensberg as the name I was looking for. Solomon, I didn't know his family name. Was it a first name, a last name? So I had to search. I eventually ended up trying to search for Mieczysław. A very intricate process, which was marked, looking back on it, primarily by failure. Right? This dead end and that dead end, and this red herring, and so on. And I won't try to go through all of the details with you, but little bits and pieces would start cropping up. And with each little piece, I could take a further step in looking for this young man. And eventually, I was able to find that the name of his town in Poland, and the survivors, one of the heads of the survivors organization of that town, a wonderful man by the name of Howard Chandler. And when I finally was able to reach Chandler, he immediately said to me, I know Mieczysław. He and I were playmates together in the town. And I believe that he has come to the United States. I met him at a reunion of town survivors many years ago. Let me check around and see if I can come up with contact information. And he did. He came up with a telephone number. I took the number. It was clearly based in Connecticut. I took the number. I sat down one night and I called. And to my great despair, the recording on the other end of the line came back with the message that that number was no longer in service. And after all of these years of looking, trying to seek, while at the same time working at my own job, which was also in the diplomatic field, that was the one true moment when I did despair. But my wife and Howard Chandler said, no, you've gone too far. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. My parents happened to live not far from where I was. And one morning I went over there and told them about my search and was forthright with them in saying, look, I don't know that we're going to find him. When I left, I didn't learn until later on that my dad turned to my mother and said, one day John is going to call us and say, I found Pee Wee. I went home, and lo and behold, there was a fax waiting for me. And it was from the Holocaust Survivors Union of the town in Israel. And they sent back a small note saying that Mieczysław Eichenberg was indeed in the United States. He was indeed in Connecticut. They did not have a phone number, but they had his Americanized name. He had changed it from Mieczysław Eichenberg to Martin Wigan. And as I was absorbing this information, the phone rang. I lifted the receiver. A woman's voice came on the line. She was asking for Mr. Wickers. I thought it was a wrong number. But she said, no. Look, I've gotten a call that informed me that you're looking for a relative of mine. And I thought, oh goodness, if she's calling, the relative can't. But no, she said, he's right here. He just has a bit of a hearing problem. I'm his daughter. I want to stay on the line to help with communications. And then she handed over the phone. And this incredible, soft voice, slightly Eastern European accent came on the line. And he said, did you say your name was John Withers? And I said, yes. He said, are you related to Lieutenant John L. Withers of Greensboro, North Carolina? I said, yes, he's my father. How is your father? I saw him this morning. He's doing well. Will you tell him that I'm doing well too? And I said to him, do you remember, just out of curiosity, what the nickname the soldiers gave you? He said, yes, Pee Wee. I got all of their contact information. I was shaking. Once the conversation ended, I phoned my parents. I told them, Dad, don't be talking with any Army buddies tonight. Mom, your sister's phone call can be done tomorrow. Keep the line clear. And that night, the phone rang in their house. My dad picked up the phone and he said, Pee Wee? And Pee Wee answered, Lieutenant John. They met again almost 55 years to the day that Dachau had been liberated. And the friendship returned immediately. It was as though they had begun a conversation 55 years earlier, and they picked it up all of those years later without interruption. My dad came out of his introspection. He never again seemed to doubt the kind of life that he had led. We remained very much in touch with Pee Wee and his family, went to his granddaughter's wedding. And my dad, the two of them remained very, very close until a few years later, Pee Wee passed away. In those conversations, Pee Wee had given me information on Solomon. Solomon had gone to Israel, and he had begun working at a kibbutz, and eventually he had moved into his own shop, which provided fresh fruits and vegetables to the growing tourist industry that was coming to into Israel at that time. He unfortunately passed away before I could reach him. But through the help of one of my dear friends, Ms. Deborah Schwartz, who was at our embassy in Tel Aviv at the time, I was able to make contact with his widow. And she was able to tell me a great many things about the man that she called, and that Solomon had called, the colored soldier with the golden heart, who taught him again the better side of life. Let me end with just a few observations. People have always asked what the meaning of this story is. When my dad was still alive, he and I would actually do a tag team presentation. I would tell about the search for the young men. He would tell about his experiences there during the war. And I was always asked, you know, what was the meaning? And I'm going to repeat to you what he always said to them. The meaning is what you derive it to be. It can be a sweet story. It can be something more of a moral. It can be a candle flickering in the wind, trying not to gutter out. Or it can be a torch leading a way forward. All I would say was this. When I tell this story, I ask myself, what is the measure of a true human being? Is it wealth? Is it power? Is it fame? Or is it something simpler, humbler, something that comes from within? Pee Wee, Solomon, and Lieutenant John were about as different from each other as it was possible to be in race, in creed, in cultural experience. And yet they shared one remarkable trait in common. They had the ability to look into the eyes of another human being and see the humanity there. And in seeing that humanity, draw a human response from within that manifests itself in sympathy, compassion, and understanding. I feel very privileged to have gotten to know these men and to have seen with my own eyes that such people existed amongst us. And I take hope and a bit of confidence from that to cling to the belief that others like them are with us still. Thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this lovely event.
So before we move on to the question and answer segment, we'll hear from Dr. Mille Etienne, who will help us reflect upon the meaning of Ambassador Withers' story. And then we'll move into the Q&A led also by Dr. Etienne. I would like to mention, I would probably be remiss if I didn't mention that John Withers' book regarding his father, Lieutenant John Withers, Bombing Gilead, which you could see on the screen, is available for purchase online. Dr. Etienne is the New York Medical College Vice Chancellor for Diversity. Associate Dean for Student Affairs, and is Associate Professor in Neurology and Medicine. Dr. Etienne is also a visiting scholar at the National Center for Bioethics and Research in Healthcare at Tuskegee University, as well as captain in the United States Navy, currently serving as the Executive Officer for the Reserve Command of the USNS Comfort. Dr. Etienne earned his bachelor's degree from Yale University, and for those keeping score, that's 3 Yale men mentioned today, his MD from NYMC, and his MPH from Columbia University, where he also did his neurology residency and fellowship training. Dr. Etienne.
Thank you, Marie. Before I start, I have no disclosures. And the views I'm about to express are my own and do not represent that of the US government, the Department of Defense, nor the United States Navy. Thank you very much, Ambassador Withers, for sharing your father's remarkable story, which demonstrated so well what it means to be a true human. Through this story, as you spoke about your dad, Shlomo, and Mieczysław, and the hard work you did attempting to reunite your dad with these two, whom he had met under the worst of circumstances. I also pondered on what this story means to me today as I continue to serve in the United States Navy. As I listened to the story, I thought about the experience of Black American soldiers serving in Europe, fighting to liberate our Jewish brothers and sisters from concentration camps and the many horrors occurring in Europe during those harrowing days. What Shlomo, Mieczysław, their families, and others in their situation endured can be seen as the impossible. Who would have thought that these horrific acts could be carried out by human beings against other human beings? These acts may have made Shlomo and Mieczysław lose all faith in humanity. They were no doubt scared. It was going to be impossible to get these young men to ever trust the world again. They were in despair and may not have thought that their lives would be any more. They thought their lives would end right where they were. But what happened next is interesting. These Black men, soldiers from the United States, arrived, among whom was the young Lieutenant Withers. These soldiers took these young boys in and protected them, despite the potential for them to be dishonorably discharged and lose their access to the GI Bill. They did what any decent human being would do, which was treated these young men as their own. I doubt that Solomon and Pee Wee expected these acts, these impossible acts that may not have even been in the realm of their consciousness. Faith in humanity now begins to be restored. Yes, where humans are present, humans with a heart, humans filled with goodness, what was impossible becomes possible. These young men will try to leave the oppression behind. They will have an opportunity to rebuild their lives, but will continue to live with those scars. Scars just don't go away. This story, like other stories of Black troops serving in Europe during and after World War II, is filled with complexity, along with a mix of pride, horror, and irony. These soldiers, who were part of segregated regiments in the United States military, were fighting to free oppressed people while enduring systemic racism and discrimination at home. When these soldiers encountered the unimaginable horrors of the concentration camps, they were thrust into a deeply emotional and surreal moment, witnessing emaciated prisoners or former prisoners like Shlomo and Mieczysław, piles of dead bodies, and the sheer scale of human suffering was a shock beyond comprehension. For some, the experience deepened their resolve to fight against oppression, both abroad and in their own country. Yet the liberation of the camps also brought a paradoxical awareness. While they were being hailed as heroes by the prisoners they freed, these soldiers often returned home to a country where their own freedoms were curtailed, where segregation and Jim Crow laws relegated them to second-class citizenship. The stark contrast between being liberators of the oppressed in Europe and victims of racism in America was a bitter pill to swallow. Despite these challenges, many Black soldiers found deep meaning in their roles as liberators. They recognized the common struggle for freedom and human dignity, and their actions in freeing concentration camp prisoners became a powerful testament to their courage, humanity, and moral clarity. For these soldiers, this experience left an indelible mark. It reinforced their understanding of the fragility of human rights and fueled their determination to demand justice and equality in their own lives and the lives of others. You see, African Americans have served in the US military throughout its history, often overcoming systemic racism to contribute to the nation's defense. In the Revolutionary War, Black soldiers fought on both sides, with some seeking freedom from enslavement. Black sailors served on US ships during the War of 1812. In the Civil War, nearly 180,000 African Americans joined the Union Army, playing a crucial role in Union victories. During westward expansion, Black soldiers, known as the Buffalo Soldiers, served in segregated units, guarding the frontier and fighting in conflicts like the Spanish-American War. In World War I, over 350,000 African Americans served in segregated units. The 369th Infantry Regiment, Harlem Hellfighters, gained fame for their combat prowess. And I'm glad to have gotten to know a Harlem Hellfighter while living in Washington Heights during my neurology residency, though he had not been born at the time of the war. World War II, we have just heard about. Nearly 1 million Black Americans served, still in segregated units. Notable contributions include the Tuskegee Airmen, who had an exceptional combat record. They destroyed or damaged over 400 enemy aircrafts, sank a German destroyer. They were awarded 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, several Silver Stars, and the Congressional Gold Medal. A little known fact is that there were Haitians serving as Tuskegee Airmen. When the Haitians first arrived to serve with the airmen, they were surprised at the way the Black troops were treated and were not accustomed to this disparate treatment. One of them, named Raymond Cassignol, wrote in his autobiography that he avoided going off of the Tuskegee Army training field and off the campus because he could not bear to be made to feel inferior and the humiliation that came with it. I will share one soldier's story with you, the story of the blinding of Isaac Woodard. Hours after he was honorably discharged, he was attacked by South Carolina police while he was on the bus ride home. The attack and his injuries, which included him being left blind, sparked national outrage and galvanized the civil rights movement. Isaac Woodard's story and that of others like him motivated President Harry Truman to act. He ordered a federal investigation, The police chief was indicted, went to trial, and was acquitted. President Truman subsequently established the National Interracial Commission, submitted a civil rights bill to Congress, and ultimately issued Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948, which ended segregation, well, which had the aim of ending segregation in the US military. And mind you, this is 6 years before Brown versus the Board of Education. Before closing, I thought I'd share this news with you that Second Lieutenant Nancy Lieutenant Colon died this month. She served as a nurse in the Segregated Army Nursing Unit, but after President Truman signed the Executive Order 9981, she became the first African American integrated into the regular Army Nurse Corps. And to conclude, you can see how African Americans serving overseas during the Holocaust impacted their trajectory here in the United States. And this is why the outcome of this war is often referred to as the double V. Victory abroad against the Axis powers, and victory at home against racism, segregation, and discrimination in the United States. Today, I feel immense pride in the legacy of those soldiers who made the double V possible. Despite being marginalized, segregated, and undervalued, they displayed the extraordinary courage and humanity in fighting against tyranny and oppression. Their actions proved that Black Americans were vital to the fight for justice and freedom, both on the battlefield and in the broader fight for civil rights. This legacy serves as a powerful reminder of the resilience, strength, and moral integrity of those who came before. Knowing this history, I do feel a sense of duty to honor that legacy by striving for excellence, fostering inclusivity, and mentoring others. Thank you. We will now proceed to the Q&A. I am monitoring the chat online. So if anybody has questions, either make your way to a microphone, or if you're online, you could just type your question into the chat. The question we have from Joan Poulin is, how do we change the ongoing racism in America? Is that for me or is that for Ambassador Withers? I think, I would say, at least my comment is, I think it's beautiful as the ambassador concluded his remarks, spoke about the meaning of this story, and the importance of really just this humanity, and emphasize that these three men from very different backgrounds, by speaking to each other and getting to know each other, really just came to actually respect and see their common, the common humanity in the two of them. As a neurologist, I'll tell you, we have something in our brain called mirror neurons, and that's a really remarkable way to actually connect with other people. Someone tells you a story, you listen, actively listen to their story, so you could actually get an opportunity to understand them. As far as formally answering this question about ending racism in America, I don't think I'll be in the position to answer that. I think if I did, it would be a remarkable feat. But those are the things that we can do individually, if more of us really just take the time to appreciate each other's humanity. Ambassador Withers, did you want to comment on that question?
Well, I certainly endorse everything that you've just said, and I would only add this: learning. The key, I think, one of the absolute keys is to learn about someone else. to learn what their experience might be, to learn what their outlook might be, and at the same time, to have this as a mutual exchange of cognition, right? If we are able to, I think all too often in these modern times, when we get to know someone, we create a mental grid in our minds. We want to know, where are you from? What do you do? And all of these things that allow us to, okay, I can now place you on some kind of a grid. But what about the quality of the individual that you're seeing? That grid tells you nothing except it allows you to feel, for some unknown reason, a little bit more comfortable. But there's nothing in necessarily in achievement, wealth, in power that makes you a better human being. That is not an automatic equivalency. You can, any person, anywhere has that tremendous power to do good and to do good by other people. And it has to be, it seems to me, it has to be on an individual level. As we, if we talk about people as generalities, well, there's no, there's no one attribute that defines an entire creed or defines an entire nationality or that defines one entire race. We're all human. We all have our flaws, and we all have that incredible capacity if we are willing to assert it, to do right by our neighbors.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was at a meeting recently at a medical conference, and one of the speakers said it's very hard to hate people up close. So really, when you take the time to get to know someone, a lot of the preconceived ideas, preconceived notions, caricatures, all start to go away because you've actually gotten to know that person. Looks like a bunch of numerous questions came in here. Ambassador, did your father's experience inform your time in the Foreign Service? If so, can you provide an example?
Wait, did my father's experience inform my time in the Foreign Service? Is that the question?
Yes.
I suppose perhaps in some kind of a way. Of course, one of the critical things in that was the way I grew up. I grew up overseas. I grew up in places like Laos, and Thailand, Burma, Korea, Ethiopia, India, those kinds of places. And to adopt so much of the legacy of both my father and my mother in terms of appreciating what those cultures are, what their richness is, what they can take, what they can teach me, what I can take from the experience of another society and of other humans, wherever they come from, whatever of the many ways they hold of being human was invaluable to my own experiences.
I'm going to ask this. Yeah, we'll take one more. I have one from Sharon Halpern. I'm gonna combine her question with an additional one from me. Sharon Halpern asks, did any of your father's units speak German? And I'd like to add to that. Can you just comment on just communication without speaking? You know, how powerful that can be.
The guys all picked up what I would call soldiers' German. Just what they needed or could use in, getting around. But I don't know that there were any especially talented linguists there. My father certainly wasn't. But in terms of communicating, let me tell you a story that relates to something that Dr. Halperin mentioned. I once asked my father, we were about to be assigned to our next assignment, which was going to be in Ethiopia, in East Africa. And as was common, I would often ask him, how, we're about to fly for the first time. When was your first air flight? He would tell me a story about it. And so I asked him on this one occasion, have you ever met Africans? What was the first time that you met people from Africa? And he told me the following story. His convoy was moving through France. Again, per usual, with the supplies and the cargo in the back of the trucks. And as they were going along these long, winding roads, they swung around a corner and they came face to face with one of the French colonial units. And there they were, in their kepis, in their stockings, in the forest green uniforms that the French wore. And the convoy halted to let these troops go by, and they looked at each other, African American and African, and suddenly they just raced towards each other. The troops, for some reason, my father's soldiers believed that they were Senegalese, but they would climb up on the side of the trucks and they would shake hands and clap each other on the back. There was no real linguistic communication, maybe some pidgin French or something like that, but there was genuine delight in this immediate bond, this immediate communication that grew up between these two units. And he always remembered that. He always remembered that a soldier was a soldier. African, African American, French, German, soldiers were soldiers. And it created an impression that he never forgot.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you all for your attention.
So next we have a special presentation from Ann Bajewski. Ms. Bajewski is the director of the Touro Institute on Human Rights and the Holocaust.
My father graduated from Central Tech High School in Toronto, Canada. in the midst of the Second World War. He was 19 and anxious to sign up for action. He was to join the 17,000 men and women out of Canada's small community of 168,000 Jews who would serve in uniform. His contribution to the war effort would prove to be unique. However, it did not begin auspiciously. Soon after enrolling in the Canadian Air Force, he was sent for training in Quebec City. Waiting in line for a physical exam, he suddenly collapsed with a ruptured appendix. As he hovered near death, his mother, my grandmother, was rushed to his side. He survived, but to his great disappointment, was reassigned from training to be a bomber pilot to airfield control. He was stationed at the MacDonald Bomber and Gunnery School in Portage-la Prairie, Manitoba, where he was able to paint. He entered a Commonwealth Air Force art competition, and his entry was awarded first prize. He had just arrived to take up his position as an aircraft controller at the Yorkshire Airfield in the United Kingdom when he learned of his award. He would now be commissioned as a flying officer in the War Art Division and, once trained, would become an official war artist. Among his fellow Air Force artists were his former art teachers from high school. On the left, Charles Goldhammer, and on the right, Charles Schaefer. My father's in the middle. The following images are paintings completed during his early time, paintings and drawings, during his early time as a war artist, and are in the collection of the Canadian War Museum. Working alongside his former teachers and other distinguished artists attached to the RCAF, the Royal Canadian Air Force, at Lincoln Inn Fields in London, he went on assignment. British and American forces liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in April 1945. Canadian forces had landed in France on D-Day, June 6, 1944, and advanced through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. They pushed into Germany in early 1945. Fellow war artist and former teacher Goldhammer described what my father did when he learned about Belsen. During the war as an official war artist, Bayevsky displayed his ingenuity by picking up an abandoned German Mercedes-Benz touring car and toured the war zone on his own. He was reported missing for about 2 weeks. My father made his way to the entrance to Belsen concentration camp just days after liberation. In his own words, this is what he wrote. I was an official war artist with the RCAF when the British Army overran Belsen concentration camp in April 1945. I went on assignment with the 39th Reconnaissance Wing near Lunenburg, Germany. This squadron was posted a few miles from Belsen, and it didn't take long for me to locate the camp. The stench of death had settled over the entire area, and truckloads of dead inmates were being placed in newly dug pits by German soldiers who, as we know, denied any knowledge of the camp. On assignment, I always carry sketchbooks with me, and over the next few days, I filled them with drawings of Belsen. At the time, I was 22 years old. I am now 72, and to this day, the Belsen experience remains the cornerstone of my work. I have, over the years, produced a large body of work which has its genesis in the Holocaust, drawings, paintings, and graphics, which I may tell you that many people don't want to see and remain to be seen properly, if anyone has an idea. This photograph of a pit at Bergen-Belsen was taken by my father in 1945 and is in the collection of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. My father became, in reality, a journalist of Holocaust atrocities. Some of his Belsen work is in the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. On his second visit to Belsen, he sketched this starving German Jewish boy who died the following day. Laura Brandon, historian of art and war at the Canadian War Museum for 25 years, wrote of this piece, The Pit, which was included in an exhibition at the National Gallery of Canada. The drawing, completed on the 10th of May, 1945, shows a jumble of bone-white emaciated bodies like broken skeletons piled one on the other. The dark side of the pit, rising up behind them, provides a stark tonal contrast, while the sky above is leaden. Prominent Canadian art critic Paul Duval wrote, "Altogether, Bayefsky completed 45 works during his period as an official war artist. His renderings of the Belsen pit and malnutrition wards remain among the most personal and emotionally impacting of Canada's war paintings." When the war ended, my father traveled through Germany, Belgium, Holland, France, and Denmark, drawing and recording what he saw of the remnants of war. He returned to the Lincoln's Inn studio, where he worked his drawings into oil paintings alongside his fellow Canadian war artists. He remained deployed in London until 1946. Well-known art historian and curator Tom Smart wrote of my father's work, "The experience of the camp, which he interpreted as both document and later as compositions worked up in his studio, remain as among the most compelling and urgent examples of artistic testimony ever created in the history of art." By the mid-1990s, my father revisited the theme, or these are some of the two works that he did following the war. By the mid-1990s, my father revisited the theme that he first explored immediately after the war. He called this series of paintings and drawings his epilogue series. I'm going to read the special, insightful way in which art historian and curator Tom Smart describes it. The epilogue series comprises drawings of dancing skeletons dressed variously in army uniforms, wearing medals, or gesturing to the spectator in macabre, darkly humorous ways. The pall of war and the lingering traces of his experiences at Belsen all come together in this monumental testimony of witnessing, remembering, and accusation. For Bayefsky, the epilogue series provided him a manner of returning to an earlier memory and experience of chaos and trauma, and of the catastrophe of the Holocaust as he experienced it. In the process of working on the epilogue paintings and drawings, my father realized, as Smart puts it, that these were summative works, drawing together many different themes and concerns that he explored in his art over the course of his professional career. Smart also wrote, "The epilogue drawings frame the same impulse to live and think in visual terms, drawing from a vast fount of knowledge of the ways figuration can and has been used as a way to convey humanity. The epilogue drawings, coming at the end of my father's life, were a return to the earlier trauma of the Belsen pits. Rather than be consumed by these visions, though, the art historian puts it this way, and his family agrees. Bayefsky found solace and sentence in art, in figurative art, to speak directly and cogently about the truths and horrors he saw and experienced at such an early age. The figurative mode enabled him to express the magnitude and the complexity of what he saw and experienced. For Bayevsky, life and the life he saw had an urgency to it, an urgency that he expressed as art. The project lasted a lifetime.
Thank you, Anne. Okay, our final speaker tonight will be Rabbi Baruch Fogel, campus rabbi of Touro University.
Before I begin, I just wanted to thank Dr. Halpern for arranging these events, encouraging us to think about the Holocaust, and leading by example. Thank you to Marie for arranging these events as well, Dr. Etienne, Ms. Bayevsky. I would like to just add one historical note, if I may. I am a grandchild of 3 Holocaust survivors. My mother's 2 parents and my father's mother all were at one point in Auschwitz. Today, International Holocaust Remembrance Day commemorates the Red Army liberation of Auschwitz in January of 45. None of my grandparents were liberated on that day. The Hungarian Jews, which they were sent to Auschwitz, but then were transferred to other camps. My paternal grandmother was in Salzwedel. I don't know where my paternal grandfather went. My maternal grandmother, my mother's mother, who I'd like to speak about, she was transferred to Dachau. She was transferred to Dachau and to a subcamp, Buchberg, Kaufling. And she was liberated on April 27th, 1945. But there's something unique about that liberation that speaks to today's events, the confluence of both International Holocaust Remembrance Day and Black History Month. We heard from Ambassador Withers, Dr. Etienne, about segregated units. And that is true for most of the United States Army. However, the 12th Armored Division of the United States Army had participated at the end of the Battle of the Bulge and had lost 1,700 men fighting in early 1945. I want to get it right, if I may. After January 17th, 1945, when 1,700 men had been lost, Major General Roderick Allen desegregated the 12th Armored Division. 12th Armored Division was one of 10 divisions and only one of 2 armored divisions in the United States Army that was desegregated. Due to the loss of 1,700 men, he called up non-combat African-American soldiers to join the unit, and it was one of the desegregated units, and it was that unit that liberated this subcamp of Dachau, April 27th, 1945. One of the camps, I can't be certain that my grandmother was in that specific camp, but one of the camps that my grandmother had been in. So I think for me personally, the confluence of these days, these 2 events plays specific meaning. I'd like to share with you I know the hour's late, and I beg of your indulgence for a few more minutes, but I think it's an unbelievable thought, and I'd like to share with you a document. I didn't get a chance to upload it, and I apologize. This is the document from concentration lager Dachau. This is my grandmother's intake document. It lists her birthday, the town she's from, color of her hair, name of her parents, how tall she was, color of her eyes, ears, language she spoke. It lists the day she was taken to the ghetto, the day where she went to Auschwitz, and the day she was transferred from Auschwitz, August 1st, 1944, from Auschwitz to Dachau. And it has her signature. I recognize her signature she used. I recognize her handwriting on the bottom. And I don't speak German that well, but thanks to Google Translate, there's a line You can find this on many documents, not just her document. And I found this document is very meaningful for me. She had mentioned to me that she was in Auschwitz on Tisha B'Av, the fast day, and August 1st, 1944 was the 13th of Av. So she was in Auschwitz on the 9th of Av, and 4 days later, she was transferred to Dachau, and then eventually some of the labor camps outside of, that was part of the Dachau complex. I'd like to read to you the translation. I'm not going to bother to try reading it in German. What my grandmother signed at the bottom of this intake form, August 1st, 1944 in Dachau. I have been advised that if the above information is found to be false, I will be punished for intellectual forgery. In German, it's intellektuell Urgutkenschlang. I'm not going to bother. And every time when I found this document, and I wanted to translate every word, and I did my best, and I couldn't get over this line. Here you are, going from Auschwitz to Dachau, where her family had her mother, younger brother, 3 sisters were killed, sent to the left. When they got to Auschwitz, here she was with her sister, who was with her. She had lost her family, cousins, people were dying left and right, Auschwitz, Dachau. Here the Germans had asked them to sign that everything they said was was not a forgery. You weren't lying. Who cared? Why did they care? It bothers me. This form and this signature just it doesn't. I mean, nothing sits well. There is something so telling of this form, a form that is meticulous, a form that has to be perfectly correct. And even Dachau to sometimes use the rule of law against you. Use like, say, if you lie in this form into Dachau, you're going to be punished. That was like, and they needed a reason. It reminds me that there are people who not only do bad things or evil, they can use good words and good ideas against you. They could take words like intellectual forgery and say, oh, we're going to punish you for that. It's hard to imagine for me. Today is a day that, according to the United Nations, is a day to commemorate the Holocaust. 20 years ago, this was established, and a day to remember genocide and to prevent genocide, as it says in the resolution. And it's a little shocking how the word genocide can be used 20 years later. And I think that one of the lessons of International Holocaust Day and of this forum that has so much to me is that we should all, strive for a more perfect union where everyone definitely knows what's right from wrong, where everyone is equal, where no one is oppressed, and there's no genocide anywhere in the world. And I'd like, if you don't mind, I would like to end with the prayer for the dead. If I could ask everyone to rise, I will say it first in Hebrew and then in English. El Molei Rachamim, Shochein Bamromim, Amtei Menucha Nechon Al Kanfei Ashchina, B'malos Kedoshim Mitahorim Kizorakia Mazhirim, Es Nishmas HaKedoshim V'Atorim Shenaflu B'dei Rotzchim V'nishtach Damam, Shenehergu, Shenishchatu, V'Shenisrafu, Shenidbchu, V'Shenechad Kol Kiddush Hashem, V'Avur Shekol HaKol Mispalim Ba'ad Askaros Nishmoseihem, V'Gan Eden Teimenu Chosom Lochein Bala Rachamim Yasrein B'Seisar Knafav Li'olamim, V'Tzror B'Tzror Chaimis Nishmoseihem, Adonai Hu Nochal Osam V'Yenuchu Al Mishkovoseihem, B'Shalom V'Nomahar Amen. O God, who are full of compassion, who dwells on high, grant perfect rest in thy divine presence to all the souls of our holy and pure brethren, whose blood was spilled in the concentration camps and all the fields in Europe, who were killed, strangled, burned, and buried alive for the sanctification for thy name. For those souls we now pray, May their resting place be in the Garden of Eden. May the Master of Mercy shelter them in the shadow of his wings for an eternity, and may he bind their souls in the bond of life. Hashem is their heritage, and may they repose in peace in their resting place. And now let us say, Amen. Thank you.
So thank you, Rabbi Fogel, and thank you to all of you. That does conclude our program tonight. Thank you for sticking with us till the end. I'm glad I warned you we'd go over, and I thank you very much.